And she would call me, and my wife would ask me, who's this woman calling at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning? And so for the sake of saving my marriage, when Dr. Goldberg asked me for the 5th or 6th time to join the trauma team, I agreed. And I've been at the hospital since 2005. I estimate that we've treated more than 8,000 shooting victims in the time that I've been at the hospital. And so I thought I'd give you a little background and explain, how I got here, and then ultimately the things we've seen and the things we're currently seeing now, and then to really have a discussion about how COVID and the role that COVID plays in the gun violence that we're seeing today, because there's a lot of dispute about whether or not COVID really is a factor, and we can talk about that in a little bit. So let me put some slides up, and maybe this will. Let me see. All right, let me share my screen. And here we go. Of course, now I can't get to you. Let me see. There we go. All right. So when I was a kid, I grew up in Northern California. I grew up in Sacramento, California, which isn't necessarily known for the level of violence. It doesn't come anywhere close to the level of violence that we experience here in Philadelphia. But these are my siblings. My older brother, when I was a kid, when I was just 2, my older brother, Eric, was shot. Oh, hold on a second, let me see. For some reason, my screen isn't sharing. And then when I was 5, my older brother, Daryl, was shot. When I was 10, my sister, Angie, used one of my father's guns to commit suicide. She was just 22 years old. And I share that because, for me, this isn't just this kind of abstract idea, but I have a real sense of what it's like for families in Philadelphia. I have some sense of the magnitude, and I apologize, I said committed suicide. I remember meeting Star at an event a few years ago, and she asked me if I had ever thought about using the term completed suicide. And I actually have been using the term completed suicide since I met with Star at that event. So, the fact that I'm at the hospital right now doesn't feel like such a coincidence. It feels like something has kind of brought me to this point. And it's certainly the experiences I've had growing up are among the things that drive me in this role, and it has helped shape the way that I do the work that I do at the hospital. And I think about families and I think about patients from the perspective of somebody who is connected to this issue. When I was 10, after my sister died, a man by the name of Jess Fernandez stepped into my life. His children, his sons, were my best friends. And my mom was a single mother. She struggled to really take care of me at this time. And Jess and his wife Dee became surrogate parents to me. In a sense, I spent probably as many nights eating dinner at their house and crashing on their couch as I did in my own home. And if not for Jess, I'm not sure where I would be. Jess mediated a lot of conflicts in the neighborhood between myself and others. And he was just an incredibly important figure. Fast forward all these years, I ended up 3,000 miles away in Philadelphia and working at the hospital for about a year and a half when I was preparing to go back to California to visit my mom and see Jess and to see Dee. And I checked the weather at the Sacramento Bee website. The Sacramento Bee is our newspaper. And there was as I was looking for the weather to kind of figure out how to pack, there was a headline that grabbed my attention, and it said, "Grandfather, latest victim of gang violence." And as I clicked on the link, this was the picture that came up. And Jess had been shot to death overnight in a drive-by shooting. He was 69 years old. The hardest part for me was obviously losing Jess, but it was also knowing, after having been there for a year and a half at the hospital, and being behind the scenes, I knew what was involved in trying to save his life and the efforts that were made to resuscitate him. We have spent years at the hospital through the program that Star mentioned, the Cradle to Grave program, simply trying to teach young people in particular who are at greatest risk of pulling the trigger or being on the wrong end of the gun, what is involved in gun violence from a medical standpoint. It's often framed as a scared straight program. We take great exception to that. Unlike the Scared Straight program, we're not trying to traumatize kids. We're not threatening them. We're simply providing them a 2-hour education that explains what bullets do to bodies. And so, you know, really, when I think back on Jess and I think about his loss, you know, obviously it's not just the death, but it was all that went in to try to save him. One of the things that when we talk about gun violence in our current moment, this time that we find ourselves, it really is, you know, if you live in Philadelphia as I do, it's really, it feels sometimes like it's all people talk about is the level of gun violence. And there's plenty of blame to go around. And the fact that it really took off during the pandemic has made just a bad situation even worse. I know we can't interact, so I don't have a sense of what you would guess if I asked you, but I'm going to ask you anyway, because I was at an event today in which I kept asking this question of people. And I asked them, which has killed more people in Philadelphia this year, COVID or gun violence? And, you know, take a moment to ask yourselves. The answer that I got, you know, I was in Kensington today, and the answer that I got from most of the people that were there is that gun violence had killed more people. And it's understandable why we might feel this way, particularly now that we have a vaccine and it feels like we're kind of coming out of this thing. Although I would encourage everybody to keep wearing your masks. But the answer is COVID. COVID has killed far more people this year in Philadelphia than gun violence has. In fact, it's not even close. So you can see that we're talking about, you know, somewhere near 5 times as many people have ultimately died from COVID than have died from gun violence. This is not to downplay gun violence, but simply to say that we are talking about 2 epidemics or pandemics that are operating in tandem, particularly in certain neighborhoods. And when we add in the other issue of the opioid crisis that is impacting the same neighborhoods as COVID, as is impacting the same neighborhoods as gun violence, we are absolutely talking about a perfect storm. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But you can see how you know, we were making some progress. 2006 is back when the last time we saw more than 2,000 shootings in the city of Philadelphia. I can pretty much assure you that we're probably going to end up somewhere close to 3,000 shootings this year. We will have never seen anything like these numbers by the time all the shootings have been tallied. But we were making progress, and then somewhere around 2004, things started to reverse course, and we started to climb. And it was a gradual climb, a steady climb. And I predicted probably back in 2019 that it would take us a few years and we would get to 2,000. Little did I know that it would be the next year and that we would absolutely exceed 2,000 shootings. And then this year, we're on course, as I said, to do 3,000 shootings, and there doesn't appear to be any end in sight. Last year, there were only 8 days in the city where nobody was shot. So try to wrap your mind around that. There are many cities that will go months without anybody getting shot. And we were unable to go 8 days last year, or we only were able to go 8 days last year where nobody was shot. You can see in terms of the impact that this is going to have on hospitals. In March, at the end of March last year, I was redeployed from trauma because COVID was having such an impact on the hospital. So many of the staff were getting sick that they needed help elsewhere. We had basically stopped all the operations or the daily operations of the Boyer building, which was an outpatient building right next to Temple's main hospital, and converted that into a COVID unit. That entire building was there to treat patients from Philadelphia, from North Philadelphia in particular, who had COVID, and I got redeployed over there. And, you know, I foolishly, I guess, in hindsight, thought that what would end up happening is with the shutdown orders that it was going to keep people out of the street, and we were going to see, you know, we would see, you know, violence actually slow down. And I remember running over to the building. I was a lab runner. I was running into the COVID ICUs where people were hooked up to ventilators, and it just felt so grim. It just felt like everybody around us was dying from COVID. And then my pager would go off, and it would tell me that a shooting victim came in. And so here I was watching younger people dying from gun violence and older people from the very same neighborhoods dying from COVID. And it felt hopeless. And so you can imagine, as these two groups of individuals are really putting a strain on the hospital. I mean, just look at the numbers for shootings and how it spiked, particularly in August of last year. We had never seen anything like that. And for all time, you know, for all possible times for this to happen, for it to happen in the middle of a pandemic was something else. As I said, we felt it acutely at Temple. In 2016, we had fewer than 400 shooting victims treated at the hospital. Last year, we had 846 shooting patients just at Temple alone. As I said, we have the dubious distinction of treating the most shooting victims in the entire Commonwealth. But we should also keep in mind that that Penn Presbyterian, I think, had something like 636 shooting victims last year. Albert Einstein, I'm not sure where their numbers are, but they're probably about 100 shootings behind that. So in total, you can see how, actually it was a few hundred behind that, but you can see how just those three hospitals alone account for the vast majority of the shooting victims that were shot in the city of Philadelphia. What role do guns play? Are guns a factor? Well, you can go back to 1988 when guns represented just about half of, used in half of the homicides in the city. Last year, they were involved in more than 80% of the homicides in the shooting in the city. I was laughing because on social media, somebody suggested that that if people didn't use guns to kill one another, they would just use things like pencils. And I explained that out of all the shooting victims and out of all the homicides I had been there for, I can't recall a single individual who had ever been murdered with a pencil in all the time that I've been at Temple, the busiest hospital, not only in the state, but is certainly right up there in the country. It's foolish to believe that that people are going to be killing each other with pencils. As available as pencils are, as available as kitchen knives are. We're just not seeing them used in homicides the way that we're seeing guns being used. We've been here before. As bad as things are now, I guess it's the good news and it's the bad news. We've seen this before, and we'll ultimately see this again. Sadly, we've not really gotten below 200 homicides in the city in recent history. And we typically hover somewhere between 400 shootings or homicides every single year. We have got to figure out a way to address this issue. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of the circumstances that often contribute to this. But one thing I think it's important to point out is when we talk about gun violence, we tend to frame it as being about life and death, right? We talk about the number of homicides. I don't like to talk about, but I tend to frame it in terms of shootings because if you want to get a sense of the magnitude of gun violence in the city of Philadelphia, you can't just look at homicides. We are very good in the city at saving lives. We save more than 80% of shooting victims in the city of Philadelphia. Why that matters? Well, it's a blessing and it's a curse. The blessing is obviously that we're saving people and we're going to send them home to their families. The consequences, the social and financial costs are significant. The financial costs, and I don't have the slide here, but we're talking about billions of dollars that it ultimately costs taxpayers every year, just for those patients who are being injured in Philadelphia. But one of the things, one of the unanticipated consequences is that when we save so many people and we talk about what's happening in neighborhoods right now, it sets the stage for retaliatory violence. So individuals who aren't gravely wounded or so severely wounded that they can't really get back out there, those individuals are going to hit the streets. And we see it time and time again where a patient may have a graze wound or may have a through and through bullet wound that gets washed out and they get sent home. They will announce sometimes that they're going to go out and retaliate. And so when we are talking about numbers like this, we're talking about a tipping point in terms of violence. When we get to these kinds of numbers, the retaliation is going to continue. It's going to grow exponentially. And this is where we find ourselves right now. This is a consequence of so many people hitting those streets again after having survived shootings. And they are absolutely going to bring back one or two or sometimes three patients. I don't recall a time in the years that I've been at Temple that when we've seen so many multiple shootings. These are not shootings that make the news. They may make, have a blip on local news, but they're certainly not making national news in the way that you see mass shootings being played out in suburban areas, in movie theaters, college campuses, or the like. But these mass shootings are happening on a far too regular basis here in Philadelphia. The shooting victims year after year are consistent with the numbers that we saw last year. Shooting victims in the city of Philadelphia are overwhelmingly African American. The segment of shooting victims who are Hispanic has grown significantly in the last decade. The percentage of white shooting victims has remained pretty steady, but the absolute number of white shooting victims grew pretty substantially last year. And it really is the law of large numbers. We just had so many shooting victims. The age group is also, it's also important to point out, because as you can see, that group between, that 12 years between, or 13 years between 18 and 30 is where the action is. This is the group that is getting shot the most. So it's important. I absolutely agree that it's important to address youth gun violence. And we'll talk in just a second about the number of young people, children who've been shot this year. But we can't ignore the fact that so many of the shooting victims, that more than half of the shooting victims in the city fall within those 13 years between 18 and 30. But again, going back to the number of children who were shot last year, I again don't recall a time when so many kids had been shot. There were at least 300 children in the city last year who were of school age, 18 and younger. And as I point out here, you would need 10 classrooms to hold all of the children who were shot, or all of the school age children who were shot in the city of Philadelphia. Tamara was one of them. He was a 14-year-old kid that they believe was wounded or shot in a case of mistaken identity. The number of kids who were age 14, I think 14 and younger, or 15 and younger, increased by 164%. And so again, it's, you want to talk about adding insult to injury, to see so many young kids being shot really says it really speaks to the dire situation in which we find ourselves. It's become relatively normative. It feels like we can't go 2 or 3 days without hearing about a 13 or 14 or 15-year-old who's been shot. I know this, unfortunately, because first responders, police officers, journalists will send me texts the moment that they catch wind of a child who's been shot. And again, I just don't recall a time when we've seen so much carnage among such young people. Unfortunately, it's not just children who are being wounded at a greater rate. It's women. I've been talking about this for years to anyone who will listen. And I often have journalists who will call me and say, I need a different angle. I need something to write about. What should I write about? And for years, I've been saying, write about women being shot. Because this is a disturbing trend. We're seeing more and more women. And someone, I'm not sure if it was Max Marin or somebody, finally took me up on it and wrote about it earlier this year. But the number of women who've been shot between 2013 and 2020 has increased by 194%. So the number of women who were shot last year is 194% greater than the number of women who were shot in 2013. This is Jasmine Lewis. She was an incredible athlete. I believe she went to Mastery Charter North and she was struck with a stray bullet while driving through Germantown, the unintended victim of the shooting. But again, just another one of the women who lost their lives last year in Philadelphia. Not only are women increasingly becoming the victims of gun violence, they're also sadly becoming the perpetrators of gun violence. But to talk about where gun violence is happening and the link between gun violence and poverty, you can look at this map of Philadelphia. You can look at where poverty is concentrated, and you can look at how well it overlays with the gun violence. I would argue you could also put a map of where COVID cases are the highest, and it would look a lot like these two maps. You could also put a map of redlining in Philadelphia, and it would look a lot like these two maps. So where we are in terms of the city and where it finds itself with regard to both COVID and gun violence, it's no coincidence. This is something that has happened by design. And I often say that if you ever truly want to address the issue of gun violence, you're going to have to address the economic realities. You're going to have to address the social and economic inequality. Otherwise, regardless of how well-intentioned your programs are, we're essentially rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And we are very good at that. We are great as a city in terms of finding new ways and new titles for the ways that we rearrange those deck chairs. But this is, for my money, this is where it is. I talked about a perfect storm. What would a PowerPoint presentation be without a cheesy slide, a cheesy background? So I wanted to give that to you. But in terms of the perfect storm, when we unpack some of the things that have led to where we are, it really is no mystery when you stop and think about it, right? So we think about what happened in the neighborhoods where we're seeing gun violence. It just so happened to be the same neighborhoods where people were dying from COVID. Who was dying from COVID? Well, it was oftentimes the mother, the grandmother, the aunt, the uncle, the people who were helping to pay rent, the people who were keeping the lights on, that were putting food on the table, who served essentially as the guardrails. And what ended up happening is that as homes faced increased financial strain, it increased emotional strain. It was happening at the same time as these folks were dying. Things were becoming shut down. Businesses were closing. And why that matters is because at the same time, businesses were closing, schools were closing, rec centers were closing. And now you have more and more young people who have no place to go. They're not going to school. They're doing their best to participate as they can, as we're doing right now by Zoom. But much of their time is unstructured. We know that unstructured time for young people, it can be dangerous. And it was also, all these things were kind of coinciding with the fact that they were releasing individuals from jail. Now, I realize as I go through this, these slides or these issues as they're framed will sound incredibly conservative and very old fashioned. And I think I use the term illicit, which is something my grandfather would have said, referring to illicit behavior or activity. But not to say that we shouldn't have released young men from jail. Especially when we're talking about a pandemic, we're talking about cruel and unusual punishment, the idea that we're going to house so many individuals in such close confines and have them become sick and die is inhumane. So we release those individuals. The problem was that we're looking at individuals who are coming home to homes where the gatekeepers or the guardrails or the providers had died. The neighborhoods had become destabilized. These individuals were coming home from jail, and the places that would ordinarily give them a second chance, like small businesses, mom and pop shops, they were closing too. And so now there was no place for them. So nobody at home to help them, put food on the table, no businesses to turn to help them put food on the table. So what did they do? They hit the streets, and they were engaged in, some of them were engaged in illicit trades, and those who were not still were finding themselves in the street sorting out their disputes. One of the things, one of my favorite psychologists is an individual by the name of James Gilligan, who has argued, he's an expert in criminal violence and criminal psychology. He argues that basically all acts of violence are rooted in shame. And if that is in fact true, and I suspect that it might be true, think about what it's like to find yourself now the primary care provider or the primary provider in a home, and you don't have the ability to now take care of your siblings or even your own children, and what the toll that takes on us. And so now these disputes that are being played out in the streets have even more meaning. The slightest conflicts take on even greater meaning. And then another thing that was happening at the same time that all of this is occurring is, of course, stimulus checks were being sent out. And again, this is not to say that stimulus checks should not have been sent out. They absolutely were desperately needed. But what was happening for individuals who were in those streets where there were already so many guns is that they were buying guns because it became an arms race. And when we would talk to young men who had been shot and we'd ask them, what's going on out there? Like, what is contributing to this? We would hear time and time again, everybody's buying guns. And if you are in those neighborhoods where everybody's buying guns and you realize that the smallest conflict, whether it was in person or on social media, which is really one of the great contributors to the violence that we're seeing right now, you didn't want to be the person without a gun. And so you ended up with this neighborhood level arms race. You see it playing out when you look at the law enforcement officers in the city who will post pictures of their gun confiscations. What you'll end up seeing is that we went from these kind of old hand-me-down guns. In the neighborhood, they used to call them the cowboy guns, the revolvers. They were now being upgraded. You were seeing semi-automatics. And even while you used to see semi-automatics in the past, you were now seeing semi-automatics that were outfitted with lasers and all the optics that were brand new. And it was an indication that these were being purchased out of stores because they could now afford to, thanks to stimulus money, stimulus checks, they're able to afford guns that they otherwise would not have been able to afford in the past. And so now, as more and more people are buying guns, more and more people are going to buy guns to protect themselves against all those other people who bought guns. Guns are flooding the streets. And as I mentioned before, these shootings were turning into exponentially expanding retaliatory shootings. One of the things that we know is that when we talk about retaliatory shootings, it's not limited to two people who have conflict with one another. Sometimes when it, for instance, if my best friend is shot, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to retaliate against the individual that shot him. If I cannot find the individual who shot him, I'm going to engage in retaliation by proxy. It'll be an imperfect retaliation. I may shoot his friend, I may shoot one of his family members, I may shoot multiple people who are affiliated with him. But then what that means is those individuals, whether it's 2 or 3, are now going to come back, and they're all going to have to get their pound of flesh, and they're going to retaliate against my friends. They'll try to retaliate against me, but if they can't find me, again, it'll be an imperfect retaliation. It'll be retaliation by proxy, and they're going to go after people who are affiliated with me, and so on and so on. And so if we need some type of explainer for how we find ourselves at a place where we have 3,000, we're going to probably reach 3,000 shootings this year. This is what it is. What did we do at the hospital? And I'll go ahead and wrap this up as we close in on the 20-minute mark left. We put in place last year, the year before, actually in 2019, as we saw the numbers start to creep up slowly, we put in place a group of advocates. It's one of the few hospitals in the area where when somebody gets shot, there is a crisis responder who is part of the trauma team, who's specifically dedicated to supporting emotionally, initially emotionally supporting the victim. Our advocates will go into the trauma bay, hold hands if they need to, get information so that if they need to call the victim's family, they'll make that phone call and try to do it in as compassionate a way as possible. Meet the family at the parking lot, walk them in, try to give them the most up-to-date information that they have. And then their role is, I hate to say it, but is often kind of being a grief concierge and to help them navigate this healthcare system and to work through what's going to come. And one of the things that the advocate does is to try to get out in front of all of these issues, to try to make sure that we positively ID the patient when they come in, to run back and forth between the OR and the family waiting room to give the family the most up-to-date information. And in the unfortunate case of a patient dying, the advocate will coordinate with the medical staff to do the death notification. And we'll continue to support the family after the surgeon has left the room, and stay with the family and give them the kind of information and direction that they need to try to figure out how to move forward. And we have somebody devoted to that. And so I'll go through these slides. These are our advocates. We have a team there, as I said, 24/7. And it's been a real game changer for us, for the hospital staff. The doctor, the surgeons will call them right when they come out of the OR and say, where can I find the family? I want to be able to give them an update. We work with, in a way, work as a buffer between law enforcement and the patient. This isn't to suggest that we're trying to get in the way of law enforcement, but we serve to try to support law enforcement by saying, why don't we go into instead of you kind of bum rushing your way into the trauma bay, tell us what information you would need, and we'll try to get that information for you, because we want to make sure that the patient their care is the priority in this situation. Told you all of that. Since 2019, the trauma support program has linked more than 1,000 violently injured patients to crime victim services and helped them with everything from getting counseling to relocation, you name it, and burial services for their families. I have a bunch of other slides that I'm not going to get to. I want to be sure to leave time for any Q&A, and thank you. Thank you for letting me talk to you.
Hey, thank you, Scott. That was great. And by the way, the chat is open. If you have any questions that you'd like Scott to address, now is the time.
Well, since I'm unmuted, I'm actually going to ask my question directly.
Uh-oh, uh-oh.
So what are the methods that you can use to prevent the retaliatory shootings? This cycle is one that is, it's like throwing a pebble in the pond, right? It just keeps going and going and going. And I know, I just am aware of the rage that can come with no longer being able to do the things that you were able to do before, when you're particularly if you're a surviving gunshot victim, and how that can be stopped through the victim advocate program that you have, or the services that the counseling that you recommend. Are there very specific things that they do that help?
So one of the things that we're increasingly trying to accomplish, and we were sadly, working with a group, I phrase that terribly. So not sadly, but we were working with a group called the Philadelphia Anti-Drug Anti-Violence Network, who has a team of violence interrupters, essentially, that would respond to the hospital. And we would try to coordinate with them and let them know, kind of give them some information that we had on the families, and information we had in terms of kind of, the growing sense of retaliation that was building around the family. And they would work with families who were honestly just out in the parking lot, and friends and individuals, and try to intercede there. One of the things that we're trying to do on the individual level, we know that oftentimes individuals who survive, it's not always that they're going to retaliate. Sometimes their injuries are so significant, so severe, that this becomes a turning point event for them, and they want to get out of the game. They want to get out of this life of the cycle of violence. One of the areas that we're trying to build up now at the hospital is not just counseling, but actually looking at some practical things like workforce development. One of the things that's going to take them back to the street is the need to provide for themselves. And we are, again, talking about young men who oftentimes have criminal records, so it's very difficult for them to find work. So one of the things that we applied for a grant for recently is to put a workforce development specialist on staff, so that as these individuals are recuperating, we can begin having conversations about turning their lives around, but giving them some practical things. Because if you don't, these are individuals who have experienced so much letdown, who felt betrayed by the systems that were supposed to help them, that when you say, well, why don't we just get you a job? Or why don't you just go get a job? It's simply not that easy. They want something tangible. And if we can provide them something tangible, some job leads, that often will serve as a way to interrupt this cycle of violence. There's a gentleman out in LA, Father Greg Boyle, who's done great work. If you probably all know who Father Greg is, who will argue that nothing stops a bullet like a job. And we think that that's true. So those are the things that we're trying to think about. But right now there are lots of programs in the city who have been paid handsomely to try to interrupt these cycles of retaliatory violence, and it doesn't appear to be doing so well. So I would argue, as I said before, that we have to address the economic realities that are leading to that are destabilizing these neighborhoods and leading to this violence.
Which is a perfect segue.
Okay.
I have 4 questions. I'll give them to you too. One is, the first combo is a tactical and a philosophical. So the tactical is what's involved with training the advocates, the 4 people that we saw. And then the philosophical one is, and maybe that's related to what you were just saying, Scott, are you optimistic that things can get better or will get better? And then why or why not? So,
all right. So yeah,
there's the 2-parter.
Yeah. So to start with the training, there's various trainings that the advocates are required to participate in. So we have our own internal training. It's trauma informed. We hired specifically individuals who have a variety of experiences. I always say they're like the dream team. You know, it's this multicultural group. Some are bilingual. Some come from domestic violence world. Some come from the victim advocacy world. We have a young man who's on staff who is a gunshot survivor. He's fantastic. You know, we have a woman who is in her 60s who is just incredible. And then, you know, they've all gone through training to help with grief support, you know, to prepare them for this kind of work. And we're, you know, one of the things that we're trying to do better as we go forward this next year is to really work on self-care as part of the critical piece of the training that we're going through. We're also kind of devoted to this. I have a fantastic team, and it's hard to get them to take time off. You know, interestingly, the young man who survived being shot, hands down, is one of the best additions we've made to this team. But he hates taking time off, and he's somebody who, you know, he had a doctor's appointment yesterday. And I said, go to your doctor's appointment. He said, yeah, but it's, you know, and it was right in the same building. He's like, yeah, but what if something happens? I was like, I think we'll be okay for 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever it's going to take you to walk across the hall. But they're not going to be able to be effective if they get ground down by this work. And so I know that wasn't a direct answer to the question, the training, but it's something that I think we all have to think about if we're going to do this work. This is a job that absolutely takes a toll on us. And with regard to, am I optimistic? I'm a cynic by training. I'm a skeptic, but I do think that things are going to be better. I've seen them get better before, but I think sadly that we have to ultimately get to, you know, a tipping point, or as I've said, we have a natural saturation point when it comes to sorrow. And I think that we'll get there. Having said that, where we find ourselves right now is we find ourselves in, you know, I'm going to stop sharing because we're looking at, I think I can stop sharing. Jim, you might have to stop sharing because I can't find my cursor. Oh, there we go. All right.
Well, you did something. There you go. Okay. That was good.
All right. So now you get to see my big head on your screen. So one of the so one of the you know, one of the things I keep saying is that we are going to be climbing out of this for a generation, because we are talking about gun violence that was claiming lives at the same time that COVID was claiming lives. And the thing that we didn't talk about is the opioid crisis and the fact that so many people overdosed in the city of Philadelphia. So if we think about the things that were claiming lives last year, it was gun violence. Then even more than that was COVID, and then even more than that was drugs, was opioids. So it's going to take us years to emerge, and I think we will. But it's not going to happen if we don't devote resources and energy to this. When people ask, you know, how did we get here? You know, who's pulling the trigger? We know who's pulling the trigger. Who's pulling the trigger are the kids who were 5 years old back in 2006, the last time we had more than 2,000 shootings. You know, if my math is right, that was like 15 years ago. They're probably 20 years old today. They were bearing witness to the kind of carnage that we're seeing today. It's just that nobody did anything with those kids. We didn't get them into better schools. We didn't address their trauma. We didn't change really much about their circumstances. It just is that we maxed out in terms of sadness, sorrow, and violence. And they eventually found themselves here, terrified that the world was ending. We all felt it. We took away all the resources that had been there prior. And it's really not surprising that we find ourselves here. What we have to do is we have to learn from our mistakes. And we have to say, yes, we're going to address the individuals who are being shot and wounded and who find themselves in harm's way. But we also, at the same time, have to address the trauma that is being experienced by these children who are living in these neighborhoods. And we have to stabilize these neighborhoods as much as we can so that we don't find ourselves here again in another 15 years.
Great answer. So I have two final questions for you, and then we're coming up on the 8 o'clock hour.
Okay, I'll try to make it quick.
No, you're fine. You're good. I think we're 7 or 8 minutes. One is from our co-chair, Andrea. Do you have a sense from the people who are living in these neighborhoods what it would take for them to feel safe? Do they feel gun control laws would have any impact on their current level of risk of gun violence? That's sort of question one. And then the final question, which will turn it to you, is you get a tremendous thank you from one of our guests who said, the one question that kept coming back to me was, how do you, Scott, take care of yourself?
Okay.
How are you okay? Thank you for sharing your experiences. So the first one, I'll come back. So the first one was, do you have a sense from the folks in the neighborhood what it would take for them to feel safe? And do they think gun control laws would have any impact?
So what I can tell you is anecdotally, what I hear in the family waiting room when we've just told a family that their child has died is one of the first things that the family consistently says is, we got to get these damn guns off the streets.
Right.
They say that, and, you know, and I wish there were a way to record this interaction. I mean, obviously I don't want people staring at the most kind of sacred moment and painful moment, because I don't know that if I shared this with people that they would necessarily believe that this is the case. But I can, if you know nurses or social workers who work in ERs, they can probably attest to the fact that you will hear families absolutely scream, you know, we got to do something about these damn guns. I think many of them who are losing people feel that there's too much access to guns, but they also recognize the fact that we've allowed the guns to flood the street. And I'm a gun owner. So I want to be clear. I know that I'm going to lose part of the crowd, or may lose part of the crowd. I know you guys are very diverse. I know you're a diverse group of individuals. I'm a gun owner. But, you know, one of the things that the folks will say is, we got to do something about these damn guns. And we flooded the streets. And as a result of flooding the streets, we're going to continue to flood the streets, because the individuals who are in neighborhoods that have high rates of gun violence are torn, because they wish there weren't guns, but there are guns. And so one of the things that you hear all the time is, I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. They're hoping for the best, but they're preparing for the worst. And it's hard to argue that it doesn't make sense. These are pragmatic, practical decisions that they're making. We can talk about whether or not it's about holding people accountable and hitting them with tougher prison sentences. We have an abundance of research that suggests that bringing down harsher sentences just isn't a deterrent to crime. It just simply is not. And if you tell me, if I live in a neighborhood where 20 people have been shot in the last month and a half, if you tell me that, well, if I carry a gun, I'm looking at a stiffer prison sentence, I'm like, fine, you know, go for it, because I'd rather be in prison than be dead. So how do we address this? We have to try to find a way to stop the flow of guns in the neighborhood. We're going to run out of time, because I could go on a whole thing about how we, the quote unquote responsible gun owners, contribute so much to the guns that we're seeing in the streets. Hundreds of thousands of guns are stolen every year from lawful, quote unquote, lawful gun owners, responsible gun owners. There probably is no group that contributes to arming criminals more than, quote unquote, responsible gun owners. We have to take responsibility for the guns that are flooding the street. And then finally, I know you were going to bring it back to, how do I take care of myself?
Yeah,
in case that's my mom asking the question, you know, I'm not taking care.
Right here, Mrs. Charles, right?
I have tried to disconnect more this year than ever before. I have a team in place. My goal, my responsibility now, I forced myself to get out of the trauma bay. Give you a really practical example of the way the trauma has impacted me. We're having some work done at the house. There were masons here a couple of weeks ago. They were cracking stone. We live in an old stone house. They were cracking stones the old fashioned way with a chisel and hammer. It sounded so much like one of the procedures that happens in the trauma bay with gunshot patients that I found myself becoming incredibly sweaty, and my heart was racing. And I realized like I'm suffering from PTSD. I have to get away. I got to get out of this room. I am forcing myself to spend less time at the hospital. And while I'm doing it, it means that other people are having to go and spend that time in the hospital. I'm just doing the best I can to protect them. I'm taking more vacations, and unfortunately, I'm snacking way too much. So I got a treadmill and a home gym, and I'm trying to spend more time there. So that's a quick answer.
So before I turn it over, thank you. That was a great answer. Before I turn it back to Star for conclusion, I'll read you the one last comment. Quote, Philly is blessed to have Scott Charles.
Thank you.
Couldn't believe it.
Over
Wow.
back to you, Star.
Scott, thank you so much. I mean, it just, you bring home, in talking, you bring home what it's like for people who are being affected by gun violence, like the lack of choices and the you know, the feeling of not being, you know, losing the elders. I hadn't really put that together, the losing of the elders, and then
I hadn't either. Yeah.
and then the rise of gun violence. I had heard about the, you know, all it takes is looking at someone too long in the Wawa, you know, to be considered a slight type thing, but hadn't really understood how that could be, why that was occurring, and you've explained it so well, and I really appreciate it. I mean, the redlining, I mean, I don't even know how one undoes the redlining that, you know, it's been going on for what, 90 years. It was put in place in the 30s, right? And how one undoes that, and is, you know, again, it's trying to work with the government, which doesn't seem to move so slowly that it doesn't get the things accomplished that one would want to get accomplished. It's frustrating. It's really frustrating. So, but I really appreciate your talking to us so much. It's an eye opener, and you definitely speak with great authority, and I really appreciate it. And yes, continue with that self-care.
Thank you, Sarah.
That is so important. So
it was my honor to spend time with you guys. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night. Thank you for attending. All right. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Star.
Thank you guys. Be safe, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.